That's it.
Okay, I'll learn. Well, good morning. My name is George McManus Jr. I was born in the Archie neighborhood of the Old Mission Peninsula, December the 12th of 1930. I was born in the hired man's quarters on the Murray farm. Essentially, it was the second building north of Stony Beach School, which is in the intersection of Montague and M37. There was a carriage house on that farm, and my parents lived upstairs in that carriage house. My mother worked in the Murray household, and my dad worked on the farm. But in 1935, we bought out my great uncle Alfred McManus's farm, which is on the north side of Carroll Hill, also in the same neighborhood. I went to the Maple Grove School at the corner of Carroll Road and M37, which is now a wine tasting place. But in that school, I have a picture of my teacher, Mrs. Pitcher. I had K through 7 before I went on to St. Francis High School in Traverse City, and then eventually Michigan State University. The Archie neighborhood, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. For many years, I investigated how Archie, there was a post office there at one time, how Archie got that name. And Jack Salmonson put together a book, Greetings from the Peninsula Home Folk, that was written during World War II. Dave Murray was the secretary of the group. And in that book, on page 20, you'll find the answer to the question. The first postmaster of Archie was a man by the name of Warren, and Warren was an old family name on the peninsula from the Archie neighborhood. They had an infant die at the time of the naming of that post office, so he asked the government if he could name the post office Archie after his son that had died. So that's how Archie got its name. The north line of Archie neighborhood is what we used to call Swede Crossroad, which is now Island View Road. That is the line between Archie and Mapleton. The south line never was really established, but essentially it's almost everything to Traverse City with the exception of Edgewater. They had, one time was an Archie baseball team, and there was an Archie Farm Bureau, and there was an Archie Women's Club, and a lot of different organizations centered around that. When I was a boy, we went to the Archie Hall, which is located on the property that is now the Archie Park, and played volleyball in there in the wintertime. Prior to that, there had been a church there, which was gone by the time I came along. There was also a school in that neighborhood that one of my grandmothers went to. As near as I can tell was at the base of Craig, or the intersection of Craig Road and Gray Road. But that had been moved, and we'll talk a little bit about that when I came along. Now let's talk about post offices on the peninsula. At one time there were 4 post offices on the peninsula. The oldest, of course, being what we now call Old Mission. But at the time that post office was established, it was the post office of Grand Traverse. It actually started on Mackinac Island and then was moved to the present site at Old Mission. And that post office started in 1850, and it's 2 years older than the post office in Traverse City. In fact, in a way, it's responsible for Traverse City being called Traverse City, because if you read history, the post office of Grand Traverse was at Old Mission, and when Perry Hanna sent Tracy Alley to Washington to get a post office for Traverse City, he wanted to call it the post office of Grand Traverse City. And the clerk in the government postal office said that the names were too close together. He'd have to drop the Grand and just call it the post office of Traverse City. So Old Mission can take credit for that in one sense of the word. The name was changed in the Old Mission, or the Grand Traverse Post Office at Old Mission. In 1869, it became the Post Office of Old Mission. Now, there was also a post office established at Mapleton on January the 14th of 1859, which ran from 1859 to 1904. The Archie Post Office was established on February the 25th of 1885, and it was finalized in 1902. And that's kind of interesting there because it was actually finalized a few months ahead of that, and the postmaster was relieved, and then and I'm not sure this is exactly what happened, but somehow after the November election that year, the post office was reestablished and a new postmaster appointed, but then it still only lasted a year or so after that. So I'm not sure whether there was a little politics involved in that, but I wouldn't be surprised. Then there was a post office established at Neontawana, August the 1st of 1907, which was discontinued on May the 31st of 1914. So historically, we've had 4 of them. There we're down to the one at Old Mission. The Archie neighborhood, in terms of schools, I want to talk just a little about that on the peninsula. At the time I went to school, there were 7 school districts, but one at Bowers Harbor had been merged with Mapleton, so we only had 6 operating schools. Old Mission, Ogdensburg, and Mapleton were 2-room schools, and then Maple Grove, which I attended, and Stony Beach, which is at the intersection of Montague and M37, and McKinley, which is intersection of McKinley and M37, were 1-room schools. The Maple Grove School, though, was a fractional district number 7, which was a combination, as near as I can tell, it was the last school district established, and it was a parts of what had been the old Archie School district, and Stony Beach and Mapleton, those districts were fractionalized to create the Maple Grove School, which I attended. I should also talk a little bit about, I mentioned earlier M37. One of the questions you have to ask yourself is, why is M37 a state highway? It's a state highway that dead ends at Old Mission, or out at the lighthouse, and many people get confused coming through Traverse City. They enter Traverse City from the south on M37 thinking they can get to Elk Rapids or to Charlevoix or Petoskey on M37 and end up out at the lighthouse on the peninsula. Well, that story goes back to the 30s. My dad told me many times that Murray D. Van Wagner was the road commissioner for the state of Michigan, and he wanted to run for governor. And when I was a kid, the picnic tables at the state parks all had Murray D. Van Wagner etched into them on the wood. That's one thing he did, but some of the Democrats on the peninsula convinced him that if he would make M37 Center Road a state highway, he probably could get some votes off the peninsula. And so he did that. He designated M37 a state highway, and my dad, who was a Democrat at the time, always complained he didn't get any more votes after he made it a state highway than he would have before. So, But anyway, it does provide state funding for the upkeep of a state highway to the Grand Traverse County Road Commission, so I suppose that's a plus. There's another story they tell about Mr. Bostwick had a farm north of where East Shore Road comes out onto M37, and he didn't want the highway to come too close to his house, so he built 2 stone pillars, which I think still stand there, stuck his mailbox in one of them, which shoved the road out closer to the bay and not quite so close to his house. And I don't know whether that's was a very smart thing to do or not. My ancestry on the peninsula goes back to 2 sets of great-grandparents. My great-grandfather Thomas Arthur McManus and his wife Mary emigrated from Quebec in Canada in 1867. Came to the peninsula and bought 80 acres on what's now known as Devil's Dive Road. They came from the township of Huntington in Quebec, and that's quite an interesting situation. Most of Quebec constituted parishes, but there were a little section of Quebec south of the St. Lawrence River, just east of Lake Ontario and north of New York, that had been not settled by the French before the English took over, and so that little section is divided into 3 townships, Dundee and Godmanchester and one other, and the town of Huntington is the central county seat. And my great-great-grandfather James McManus and his wife Nancy Crawley settled, and I've never established whether they came there directly from Ireland or there was another generation in the eastern part of Canada. But in any case, Thomas and Mary came here by sailing vessel from Quebec, and the story that the family always told was the fact that they got into a storm before they got to Bowers Harbor, and the captain of the ship wanted my great-grandfather to kick his horses overboard. And my great-grandfather said he wouldn't do that. He'd throw the harness over if they needed to get rid of some weight, but he wouldn't kick off the horses. But anyway, he got to Bowers Harbor with his team and then drove up the road to settle. He bought from the Johnson family, which our ancestry to Tim Carroll lives on the property right across from the Catholic Church now. Johnson had homesteaded 160 acres just west of the Catholic Church, and he sold McManus, my great-grandfather, the west 80 acres of that. And Tim told me some time ago that the reason that was done is that Mrs. Johnson, his wife, wanted to have the house up by the church on Center Road and not down by the pond on the complete west end of the property. And so he sold McManus to get the money to build that house that Tim now lives in and has reconstructed. McManus, my great-grandfather, sold his farm in Canada to his brother-in-law, and it's kind of an interesting deed because my great-grandmother gave up her right of dower in the process, so he got about $1,200 out of the property so he could buy that 80 acres from Johnson. My grandfather was born in United States in 1872 on that property. He had 2 older siblings, Alfred and Henry, that were actually born in Canada, came with the old folks, but Grandpa was born on that property, and he was actually from Mapleton. My other set of great-grandparents was Edward and Carol, and Jane Eliza Holman Carroll. They actually came a little earlier than the McManuses, and my great-grandfather Carroll somehow had obtained a U.S. patent from a veteran of the War of 1812 from the Vermont militia. This veteran had got a patent for 160 acres of land in Section 4 of the peninsula, which is on Carroll Road, what you call Carroll Road today. If you drive back to the Maple Grove School a little bit, then you got to make a right-hand turn, and that 160 acres that sits east of that, which now includes the subdivision or part of it up there where the old Bluffs used to be, the Bluffs area. That was settled by my great-grandfather. Now, he brought my great-great-grandfather Carroll, Peter Carroll, later to the peninsula, about 1873. So the great-grandfather came first, and then the great-great-grandfather came actually later. And he, Peter Carroll, settled on the top of Carroll Hill. Beverly Carroll lives there today. That property has been in Carroll name since 1873. And one time there was a Frederick Tower there that the people in Traverse had built to promote a tourist industry. It's one of the greatest places on the peninsula for viewing both bays and the orchards and so on. But Edward Carroll, the great-grandfather, he eventually sold or gave the property in Section 4 behind what's now the school, Maple Grove School, and moved north to the property essentially where Island View Road intersects M37, just to the south of that. And he had a bunch of boys. Alex Carroll, he gave the south 80 acres of that original homestead. And then Alex married Daisy Johnson, and she inherited the property where Tim Carroll lives now, across from the Catholic Church, which is a better farm, because that piece that he had originally had on that South 80 was very hilly and pretty difficult to farm, and so Edward moved up there. But he gave Alex that South 80. He intended to give John, his son John, the North 80, right behind the Maple Grove School. And they had a deal where he and John cut logs one winter off that 80, and the money was to go to great-grandfather Edward. But when he went into the mill to collect the check in the spring, John had taken the money with each load that he delivered and spent it. So the great-grandfather considered that's enough for his inheritance and kept the property, which he eventually sold to my grandfather, Arthur McManus, and his wife, Eliza Jane Carroll, that was Edward's youngest daughter, for $500 the property. So my grandpa did not inherit, or my grandmother did not inherit from Edward Carroll. They actually bought the property. It was supposed to go to John. Now when you get down to the intersection of Island View Road and M37, great-grandfather owned several pieces of property in that area. He had the corner piece that they're talking about building a new Catholic church on. It went to his son Lawrence, and Lawrence Carroll had that piece, and then where Gary Warren lives was Steve Carroll, and then on the on the southwest or southwest corner of that intersection was Andrew Carroll. And then the farm that I was raised on, which was actually bought by Alfred McManus from George Carroll, those were all sons of